Good evening. I want to take a minute thank, to thank Michael. I hadn't really thought about trying to find a song for a Sabbath sermon, but I think Be Still My Soul is a very good pick for that, about trusting in God and also about looking forward to final rest with Him. This evening, we're going to be spending most of our time in the book of Mark at the end of chapter 2 and at the beginning of chapter 3. But since we're going to be talking about the Sabbath, we're going to look at a lot of passages in the Old Testament as well. When God first made the covenant with the Israelites at Mount Sinai, He gave them 10 fundamental commands. The first was, "You shall have no other gods before me." And then, "You shall make no carved image or bow down to it." And thirdly, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." And the fourth command is this: "You shall remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." One of God's 10 fundamental commands for His people was that they keep the seventh day holy, that they rest on it. They rest from their labor. Why? Why did God give them that command? Why remember the Sabbath? Why rest? And why is that important for us to consider today? In light of those questions, and especially the last one, this is what we're going to be doing this evening. We're going to look at passages in the Old Testament concerning the Sabbath day. After that, we will look at Mark chapter 2, the first time the Pharisees come upon Jesus and his disciples. We're going to look at how Jesus answers them when he references David and the showbread. And then finally, we're going to look at Jesus healing the man on the Sabbath in Mark chapter 3. And of course, we'll conclude all that, tying these things all together, and especially considering what the Sabbath means for us today. So let's begin looking at passages in the Old Testament. There'll be a lot of verses pretty quick, but most of them will be up here on the screen. Jeremiah 17, verse 22, is a good summary statement about the Sabbath, and this is what that prophet says. It says, "Do not carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath, nor do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy, as I had commanded your fathers." In the days of Jeremiah, hundreds of years after the covenant was made, this was something the people were supposed to know and to practice. But they didn't always do that. Jeremiah's words here make it very clear this command is tied to sacrificing to God, specifically giving up a day when one would work for themselves and instead surrendering that to God, surrendering a whole day to Him. Isaiah 58 is probably one of my favorite passages in the Bible, and I think it does an excellent job of summarizing what the Sabbath means in practice. Isaiah 58, just verse 13, says this. God, speaking to his people through Isaiah, says, "You must observe the Sabbath rather than doing anything you please on my holy day. You must look forward to the Sabbath and treat the Lord's day with respect." You must rest on it or treat it with respect by refraining from your normal activities and by refraining from your selfish pursuits and from making business deals. You look at this verse, you look at the whole chapter, and what Isaiah is saying is that the Sabbath in practice is doing no work and specifically refraining from work for self. And a key this evening is that it's that point the Pharisees have lost sight of. That is a key idea they have forgotten. So that's a summary of the Sabbath. This is what it looks like in practice. And here are a couple more keys to really understand why God is commanding the Israelites to observe the Sabbath in the Old Testament. All of these forward the idea of the people's gratitude toward their Creator. This is what God says in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. Recall that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there by strength and by power. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Exodus 31, verse 13. Tell the Israelites, surely you must keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Then in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, this is what God says. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them. And he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. These passages make the following things very clear. The Sabbath is connected to their salvation. It says, I rescued you from the slavery you experienced in Egypt. So you need to set apart this day to me. Sacrifice it for rest and worship, to set it apart for me. We also saw that it's a perpetual command with signs for it. Perpetual covenant that identifies them as God's people. They're doing it weekly, and they are setting their entire lives and identity aside to this. And lastly, we just read that it's directly connected to the 7 days of creation. God said, I created the world in 7 days, therefore rest on the seventh day as I rested. And if we think back to Genesis, like we just read a little bit ago, let's make it clear that God did not rest out of weariness, but rather to abide with his creation. Genesis 2 and 3 show that God walked in the garden alongside Adam and Eve. And also in those chapters, we see that God gave Adam good work to do in the garden. But after they sinned, Adam's work was subjected to futility, and thorns infested the ground, so that his work was robbed of the fulfillment that he had at first. And they're robbed of this again because humankind chose to define good and evil for themselves rather than obeying God and sharing in the life and rest that he had freely offered them. All this is God's word to Israel. Many nations had holy days to their pagan gods, but only Israel had a day of rest for all people, male and female, slave and free, native born and sojourner. This was God's gift to his people, and we mentioned that in the Bible class this morning also. This was a day to draw near to their Creator and a day to bless others by ceasing from their own toil and instead focusing on fulfilling work of providing for one another, just as Isaiah 58 describes. Again, the Sabbath day was one of the marks of their identity as God's chosen people. It was called a covenant sign just like the tassels they were to wear, mentioned in Numbers 15, and the covenant sign, of course, just like circumcision. So, what was God's design with all of these commands? It's this. God wanted anyone who encountered his people to know who they belonged to. He wanted to know what set them apart from everyone else. And the most startling thing about the Israelites was it was unlike every other nation. They set aside a weekly day of rest. They laid down their own toil and their own ambitions so they could help others and to worship their one God. Together, all these passages we've considered tell us that the Sabbath day is ultimately a reminder of how we're in a broken world, and it's also the beginning of God's promise of how that world will be restored. In the beginning, as we read, God created mankind to live with him in rest and harmony, to share his life and rest. But mankind chose otherwise. The moment that humanity was separated from God, God began a plan to bring them back to him. Powerful step in that plan came at Mount Sinai when God said, "Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy," so that they would weekly remember that their first purpose and the purpose that God would give them again was to rest with their Creator. All of the Ten Commandments are recommanded by Jesus, but many things in the law of Moses were not. Jesus never told his people and his kingdom to practice animal sacrifice or priestly sanctification or dietary restrictions and so on and so forth. But all the Ten Commandments are recommanded by Jesus, except the fourth command, except the command to remember the Sabbath. But if we're no longer under the law of Moses, which is true, why spend so much time considering the Sabbath? And beyond that, here in Mark chapter 2, as we're about to read together, why does Jesus call himself the Lord of the Sabbath? What is he trying to communicate to the Pharisees and to his disciples by claiming that title and reminding the people that that's who he is? Well, obviously, to answer that, we'll need to turn our attention to Mark chapter 2. So if you're not already there, please turn to Mark chapter 2, and we'll begin reading in verse 23. Mark 2, beginning in verse 23. This is what Mark says. On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God at the time of Abiathar being the high priest. He ate the bread of the presence, the showbread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and also gave some to his companions. Then he told them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." You read through here, and it's pretty clear what the Pharisees are up to, trying to entrap Jesus and make trouble for him and his disciples. But what's Jesus doing here? What does he mean by appealing to this episode in David's life recorded in 1 Samuel 21? There's two major explanations for this. One that I've commonly heard is that Jesus is saying David is justified in breaking the letter of the law in order to preserve the lives of his loyal and starving men, because the law of God is not meant to be a lethal burden to people. The second option I've heard is that Jesus is simply calling out the Pharisees' hypocrisy, that they justify David's breaking of the law, which is true. That's what Pharisees did during this time. But at the same breath, they're persecuting and burdening those who break their human commandments. Those are the two options, two major options. And when articulated well, I don't think the first option is entirely wrong, but given the overwhelming number of Sabbath traditions that existed in first century Judaism, I would lean more toward the second option. But either way, by the end of the chapter, we clearly arrive at Jesus challenging the Pharisees on their hypocrisy concerning their traditions and the further hypocrisy and abuse that stems from their overemphasis of their traditions. And we're going to talk about Jesus' rebuttal to the Pharisees, his claim that the Sabbath is made for man and not vice versa, and that he is Lord of the Sabbath. But before we do that, let's look at the overwhelming number of first century Sabbath commands that existed in Judaism at this time. The Pharisees had a lot of oral traditions, which would later be written down in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And we need to understand that even though the Pharisees ended up having a huge misunderstanding, ended up being very wide of the mark, the initial motivation was good for many of them. That they wanted to treat the Sabbath with reverence is a good thing. There's even a passage from the Talmud that very likely reflects what many Pharisees were taught about the Sabbath. I think it fits right along with Isaiah 58. One passage in the Talmud says, "Whoever observes the Sabbath becomes partner with God in the creation of the world and brings salvation." That seems like a good idea to hold fast to. But here, in practice, we see a lot of mistakes from the Pharisees. They say, "Why are your disciples doing what is not lawful? Why are they taking the grain in this way?" And what the disciples are doing is not something the Pharisees would have cared about on other 6 days of the week. But the Mishnah, their oral traditions, identify 39 classifications of work. And to violate any one of these 39 Sabbath rules was like violating the God-given law of Moses from their perspective. And specifically, technically speaking, which I'm sure is the way the Pharisees were speaking, the disciples were violating 4 of the 39 rules. They were working by reaping, that is, gathering the grain, by winnowing, and they were working by threshing, by separating the grain from the rest of the plant, and they were working by meal preparation from their perspective. And isn't it clear they're entirely missing the point? This is absurdly pedantic. And I hope it's obvious that the key we need to learn from this episode of Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees is that the Pharisees are acting hypocritically. They're applying their standards and elevating human tradition to be equal to those things which came from God. And that ought not be so. In fact, they're missing the point so badly that they're entirely neglecting the spirit and even, I think, the law, or the letter rather, of the original law. These are commands about Sabbath rest, and they're stringently enforcing rest. I think they're missing the point here. They level this charge against Jesus and his disciples, and ultimately, Jesus responds by saying, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." What's that mean? What it means is the purpose of the Sabbath is not to subject us to futility or to useless thumb twiddling. The purpose of the Sabbath is to give us a great gift. When God gives us a gift, that means we don't have to choose between sitting inside and praying and helping someone in need. With Christ, those things go together. That's not something the Pharisees understand at this time. It's clear, looking at the Old Testament commands, that God originally commanded the Sabbath in order to stave off selfishness, not to provide a club for people to legalistically pound and oppress people. But here the Pharisees are, and they're spouting off endless doctrines that are causing people to refrain from helping others in need. And so, in trying to preserve the Sabbath's holiness, they are squashing it underneath layers and layers of human opinion and interpretation that prevent people from doing what God wanted them to do in the first place. There's a couple other places that Jesus exposes their hypocrisy. If you'd like, you can turn to Matthew chapter 23. This is the longest reading I have here. In the midst of all the woes that Jesus pronounces against the Pharisees, this is what he begins with. This is Matthew 23, beginning here in verse 2. Or verse 1, rather. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, and he said, "The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. Therefore do whatever they tell you and observe it. But don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. Listen to this especially. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. They do everything to be seen by others. They enlarge their phylacteries, lengthen their tassels. They love the place of honor at the banquets, the front seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called rabbi by the people. Luke 13, verse 15 says this from Jesus: You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from its stall and lead it to water? And then in John 7, verse 23, if a male child is circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses is broken, why are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? These passages show us that the Pharisees abused their power, as evidenced by treating animals better than people. And we also see, right on brand for them, they placed the outer representations and the representative rituals at higher importance over the spirit of the law. They're willing, Jesus says, to break the Sabbath to circumcise a child, but when Jesus is saving someone, healing them, they begin to plot to kill him. It's such obvious hypocrisy, but the Pharisees are so steeped in their own perspectives and traditions that they fail to see the absurdity of their position. And it's terrifying that people are able to be moved into a position like that. Jesus says here in Mark chapter 2, the Sabbath is for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. And the final thing that Jesus tells them is that he is Lord of the Sabbath. If you boil this down, this is the Pharisees' mistake. They don't recognize this truth. They aren't treating Jesus as Lord. They would admit to that wholeheartedly. But they're not even treating God generally as Lord. And they would be appalled to hear someone outright accuse them of that. But they are, because they're conflating human tradition with the oracles of God. And that should not be the case. We need to think about ourselves here too. If Jesus is Lord, our efforts and interpretations must be subject to him. We need to come to him on his terms, not our own. And Mike spoke wonderfully at this in the lesson this morning, where the Pharisees' interpretation of fasting shows their bankruptcy in this view as well. No matter what interpretations seem to make sense to us, no matter what traditions we treasure, we cannot usurp God from his throne of authority. Part of being the Lord of the Sabbath means God is our creator. And if we believe that's true, we need to live humbly, as is necessary in the relationship between a created thing and a creator. We need to remember that. We need to be humble. And you read through the Gospels and you see so many examples that prove the Pharisees had forgotten to hold the necessary humility. Before we move on to Mark chapter 3, let's spend some time thinking about this. What do we elevate to take God's place ourselves? It's pretty clear what the Pharisees are doing, but what about for us? What traditions or interpretations do we make idols out of? And I'm asking this to encourage you to think humbly and carefully. I hope that is something you continue to think about even after this evening. But I also have a story I'd like to share that I got from an acquaintance of mine. There was a small group of evangelists who were going to spread the gospel in the Caribbean. So they were going there to evangelize to people who weren't familiar with the gospel and also to encourage churches there. And at least one of these churches, this group of evangelists found a congregation where they clapped at different times during the service. maybe a little bit during the singing or when there was a joyous sort of announcement during baptisms or things like that. These evangelists were from America. None of the churches they were familiar with did any sort of clapping. And so they told that church in the Caribbean, don't do any clapping. And I'm not here to tell you whether to clap or not to clap, but I want you to listen to this. What my acquaintance heard from that church is a thing that church, sorry, what my acquaintance heard from that church is the thing those evangelists are most remembered for is that they told them not to clap. That's their legacy to that church. The thing they remember most about them is they told them to stop clapping. I don't know everything about the evangelists or the church there, but I do want to invite you to think seriously about the impact we make on other people's lives. What we make clear is important to us. Because the most important thing should be that Jesus is Lord and the clear commands we have from him. The Pharisees were tempted to bind what they thought was super important, even though it was just their traditions. And they focused on that so much that they neglected to show people what God had actually commanded. And how tragic it would be if teaching something entirely unnecessary led rightly exasperated people to turn their backs on the amazing gift of salvation. Salvation that should have been the heart of the message in the first place. What do we elevate to take God's place? What traditions or interpretations do we make idols out of? What impact are we making on people? Mark chapter 3 is the second verse that's just like the first, a little bit louder and a little bit worse. We already saw how terribly the Pharisees had misunderstood the Sabbath, and chapter 3 is going to double down on that in an even more mind-boggling, exasperating way. So read with me, Mark chapter 3, starting here in verse 1. Mark 3, beginning in verse 1. Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a shriveled hand. In order to accuse him, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. He told the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand before us." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved at their hardness of heart, and he told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and his hand was immediately restored. Immediately the Pharisees went out, and they started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might kill him. We've already looked at the Pharisees' dynamic with their oral traditions, the Mishnah, Talmud. But here's one more thing to consider. It's a teaching that appears in the Mishnah and also in First Maccabees. This idea that exceptions to the law are determined by essentially asking, does this preserve life? That's a question a lot of Pharisees ask, but not all of them. According to some, the deciding factor for whether or not something was forbidden on the Sabbath or not was whether or not extenuating circumstances meant a human life would be saved. Since Jesus goes on to use this as the basis of his appeal, I think the Pharisees were on the right track with that one. In contrast, there are also a lot of Pharisees who said healing did qualify as work. A couple examples are teachings that say if you encounter someone who a wall has collapsed onto, you are allowed to move just the bare minimum of rocks to check and see if the guy under the wall is alive. If he's alive, only then can you move the amount of stones to pull the whole man out of the rubble. They also limited the amount of healing you could do with bandaging. If someone got cut or wounded in some way, you could do a bare minimum binding, but you could add no medical salve or ointment. And again, I think this is an example to show that their traditions were so strong, it almost entirely obscured God's higher intentions. Read through what we saw in the Old Testament, and this is absurd. This is not the kind of refraining from work God intended. And here in Mark chapter 3, the Pharisees are literally lying in wait to see if they can denounce Jesus for healing someone on the Sabbath. Jesus comes forward because there's a man who needs healing. And he looks around at all of them. And just imagine this scene. He says, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or evil? To save life or to kill?" No one answers him at all. And this is very telling. Look at verse 5 and continue imagining this. Everyone's silent around him. Jesus looks around, and everyone would be able to see the anger and grief in his eyes, that their hearts have remained hard. They're either so set in their ways or so angry at him that they're not willing to answer or honestly think about what he's saying, or else people are too scared to challenge the Pharisees. They're waiting to hear what the Pharisees say. Jesus is so grieved and angry because the answer is obvious. They're not willing to change here. Obviously, Jesus chooses to do the good thing. He heals the man with the withered hand, which again is the obvious answer to the question he was asking. And note this gross irony that the Pharisees immediately leave and begin scheming on how to take his life. It's not lawful, according to them, to heal a man on the Sabbath, but it's entirely acceptable to plot to kill somebody on the Sabbath. This is the clearest example of how they've entirely missed the point of God's teachings. It's such a tragic irony. It's hard to see the foolishness of the Pharisees and their pride. There's also something very beautiful here in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Because this healing illustrates God's grace and the next step of the Sabbath promise, which is a promise the Pharisees and so many Jews had lost sight of. But catch this. If there was a day to heal somebody, it would be the Sabbath day. Healing somebody is going to be wonderful anytime that it happens. But for a Jew, for a Pharisee, what better day than the Sabbath, which is the day that's a reminder of the restoration with God and rest in his presence? This is the perfect day to restore somebody. Healing's wonderful. That's part of what we're going to enjoy in God's presence in our life to come. But it's not the most important thing. The fulfillment of the Sabbath promise is the new covenant with our Lord. The new covenant that Jesus ushered in by way of the cross through his resurrection and then ascension and glorification. It's in light of that the Hebrew writer says in verse 4, chapter 9, there remains a rest. Make every effort to take hold of it, as he's encouraging Christians to leave behind Jewish traditions and entirely embrace Christ and his kingdom. And if we had more time, that would be a great passage to look at more closely, but you can do that in your own time. In the beginning, mankind was cast out of God's presence. But from that very moment, God began, and from that moment and before, God began to plan on how to restore them to himself, to bring them back into his life-giving, rest-bringing presence. In Israel, the people were exiled in the first place because they failed to keep the Sabbath commands and the Jubilee commands. They were cast out because of God's wrath. And God swore, as the Hebrew writer says, that they would not enter into his rest. But now a new covenant is here, a better covenant, a better promise, and the fulfillment of the promise. And we can enter into the life that Christ is offering despite our betrayals, despite our weaknesses. Christ has promised we can find fulfillment in the midst of a world we see as terrible, incomplete, and utterly ruinous. We can find fulfillment here because we have hope in what's to come. And we need to praise God for this amazing grace that He has given us. We need to listen to what the writer of Hebrews is saying. We need to work mightily to take hold of God's promise and to lead others to do the same thing. Sorry, I forgot to update the slides there. But here in Mark chapter 3, we've of course seen the folly of the Pharisees, the consistency and mercy of Christ, and ultimately what the Sabbath is pointing forward to, which is a restoration of created thing with its creator. Promise of rest and fulfillment. Here's the final thought this evening. Are you weary? Maybe this minute the answer is no, I'm doing pretty good. But it doesn't take long to get to a state where you feel weary. And if a 24-year-old can feel pretty weary, I'm sure there's a lot of you out there who feel a whole lot more weary than I am, who've been through more hardships than I have been. But life is really hard. So when the answer to this question is yes, remember that God has always wanted you to be with Him. He loves you. He wants to restore you to His presence. He wants to put you to good, fulfilling work, not useless, rotting pleasure, but satisfaction and fulfillment and protection from evil and hardship. Remember that as we're waiting for the final rest, we need to take the principles from the Old Testament and to sacrifice our ambitions to Christ. We need to rest from worldly desires and work mightily for the Lord in all the things that we do. The Jewish people had one day. We don't have any parallel to that for us under Christ. We don't have one day. But Jesus is asking us to live according to the Sabbath every day, every moment, remembering to rely on Him, to rest from evil, to look forward to what He's promised, true rest and true fulfillment. There's at least one good thing in the Talmud here. Remember, they said, whoever observes the Sabbath becomes a partner with God in the creation of the world and brings salvation. Maybe we'd phrase it a little differently, but God does want to be partners with you in bringing salvation to people and in a way in bringing about the new kingdom that He's promised and already established. He wants you to be there, and you're the deciding factor for that. And He wants to use you to bring more and more people to inherit that amazing promise. So we're all weary most of the time, I would venture to say. If you look out of the world, that's certainly how people apart from Christ are feeling, right? Weary. There's so many trials, there's so many temptations and tribulations, wars, discouragements, pain, all kinds of suffering, sickness, and the tragedy of death. The fear of that if you're going toward it, and the pain for those left behind when a loved one passes away. This world is very hard. It makes you very tired. It makes you feel very weary. There, we could go on and on listing hard things. But what I'm trying to do is no matter how specifically you're feeling, God is the solution to every single one of those things. And He wants you to share in the rest He has to offer. And we begin to share in that promise now by looking forward to it, by making the choice to surrender our ambitions and our pride to Christ. And so, if you have not yet surrendered to Christ, if you need the prayers and encouragement of the congregation here, if we can help you in any of those things or pray for you, then please come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.